Hey, it's me, Rose La Fabiloca, and we are going to take down white supremacy, one pendejo at a time. This is the Ya Tu Sabe podcast. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Ya Tu Sabe podcast, where we discuss social, political, and economic issues facing minorities in the present day. I hope you all had a freaking wonderful, safe, and healthy 4th of July weekend. I celebrated my birthday on Friday with a tiny brunch with my childhood friends, and then on Saturday, I celebrated my birthday with my immediate family, so it was a really great weekend. This quarantine business kind of sucks because I really pictured doing a lot more this year with my birthday, but the universe works in mysterious ways, right? Regardless, my oldest sister hosted my birthday and she made it so special. She had llama decorations, cheesecake, pizza, nachos, basically like all my favorite things. I'm a literal child, to be honest, but they're the best. It's crazy how well she knows me, and it's funny because you never notice what other people notice about you until you have like events and stuff, and I just felt like she really made my birthday special. So shout out to my big sister Liz. So today we are beginning the second half of season 1 with episode 11, Epigenetics and the Black Effect. We have already covered such a long range of different topics, but I am super excited to get into laying the mental groundwork for you all so you can begin introducing new concepts and ideas into your perspectives of minorities. And the last half of season 1 is going to be pretty hardcore because we're really going to be building on top of all that we have discussed from the previous episodes and really fleshing out the serious issues that have gone unanswered for so long. So definitely do your meditations, burn your incense, and make time to really decompress from these topics because, as I said in the beginning, these topics are not easy to listen to or walk away from afterward because they can be pretty heavy, so taking care of your mental health is everything. I know some of you have binge watched this on YouTube or the podcast app, and some of you are doing bits and pieces, and trust me when I say you absolutely have to go at the pace that you need to go in for your own mental well-being. So trust me, I am not offended and do not obsess over views and shares. I'm here to educate, not push numbers and ratings, which is why I say share this with your network if you care. Just be sure to hit the subscribe button so I can utilize my stats information to see how I can be a better host. So today can be a bit of a doozy because we are going to be getting into some science. Personally, for me, I am a huge science nerd, which is funny because, of course, I am also somewhat of a history nerd, but I actually graduated high school with 9 credits of science and got an award for it and like all types of shit because you're only supposed to graduate with 3. So it's safe to say I know a pretty good amount of a little science, but my favorite topic to discuss has been epigenetics. So for a bit of background, I came across this information about 2 years ago when I had lost my job at a HR software company, and when I was fired, I thought I was going to get a job like right away because my resume was pristine up until that point, and that ended up not being the case at all. In the months of being unemployed and getting constant doors slammed in my face, I threw myself into the library. It was a great getaway from everything. My unemployment, being home so much, really made me think a lot, and a lot of thinking can really bring you into different spaces that can be pretty overwhelming. Like my relationship of 6 years was getting really rocky. I was having issues with my best friend at the time, and all 3 of us lived together. So I can tell you for sure, I definitely know a thing or two about quarantine, and trust me when I say this, you guys, if you have been having a hard time mentally and emotionally with this quarantine, I completely understand because I've already been in this type of situation. before, because with no money, I couldn't just go out and do things. So I was stuck at home like 99% of the time. So when I was basically living in the library, I'd go up and down the psychology and social sciences aisles at the Lake Mary Library because I became obsessed with expanding my brain. I mentioned last episode that I haven't always had equal access to education. So at a certain point of being unemployed, I was fearing the idea of not being sharp anymore and getting like stupid, basically. Not kidding. Like I was high-key afraid of my brain just sort of getting used to not being challenged and used to it being turned off or something. And this sort of fear birthed my like second journey into this type of information after I had taken a break from it after leaving college, because college was like, well, I mean, my senior year of high school was like the first introduction to all of this kind of stuff, but then college I got like really deep into the rabbit hole. My freaking roommate at USF, Marika, she knows what I'm talking about. We were like deep in this fucking government shit while we were living at USF. So after that, I needed like a mental break from that shit, and then I didn't really do too much with that information. Like I didn't go super deep dive, so I kind of revisited this like world again when I was unemployed, and was like all this stuff just started coming back to me. And then I started reading and being like, wait a second, and just connecting dots with like my lived experiences up until that point, and then like the experiences of people around me mixed with the information that I was learning. So it was like I went through a lot. 2018 I went through a lot. Like I may not have been working, but my brain, you guys, was growing like at a rapid pace. Like I would get like literal headaches sometimes from like all the stuff that I was learning. So what is epigenetics, right? What are we talking about when we say epigenetics? Well, epigenetics is a term used in biology, and it refers to the study of heritable phenotype changes that don't involve any alterations in your DNA sequence. So let's break that down into easily digestible language. Epigenetics is a term referring to studying the biological mechanisms that are responsible for turning your genes on and off. So if you've ever paid at least like a little bit of attention in like biology in high school, you probably walked away knowing at least that the human body is made up of cells, right? We are made up of atoms, which are the particles that make up the molecules. So organic molecules combine with water and inorganic ions to form cells. So cells are what make up our tissues, and tissues make up our organs, and organs all put together to make up the human body. So being that cells are the fundamental working parts to every human being, all the instructions required to direct their activities within us are contained with chemical deoxyribonucleic acid, aka DNA. So that DNA is made up of around 3 billion nucleotides, bases, and there are 4 fundamental types of bases that make it up. So there's adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, which may jog your memory when it's abbreviated in biology as A, C, G, and T. I bet I'm freaking brain blasting the shit out of the people that were in my AP biology class with Miss Malone with me. Oh, that fucking class. I hated that class, but I loved that class. I hated the class because at that time, it just was too much work on top of the work that I already had. Like, if that was the only class I had on my schedule, it wouldn't have been so bad, but I was taking like a crazy course work that year, and I don't even know why I did that, but it was like a 2-hour class right in the morning, and it was just a lot. Like that class was too much. Okay, so that sequence of the bases is what determines our life instructions, and out of all the mammals you may have heard, we are closest in sequence to chimpanzees because only a fraction of distinctively different sequences make us humans and not chimps. Now, within those 3 billion bases that make up the DNA, there are around 20,000 genes. So genes refer to the specific sequences of bases that provide instructions on how to make important proteins. So proteins are complex molecules that trigger various biological actions to carry out life functions. So I'm not a scientist or a biologist, so I'm explaining this in the best terms that I know how to explain. trying to stay obviously scientific, but you know, if you have a better way to explain it and you're like a guru on this, then by all means comment below. So this is all the background you need in the simplest terms to understand what genetics even are. Now, epigenetics affects how genes are read by cells and subsequently whether the cells should produce relevant proteins. Now, you may have heard of the term nature versus nurture in biology classes, right? Nature versus nurture is oftentimes referred to in the context of homosexuality. For example, every single LGBTQ plus person that I've ever met has said that homosexuality is genetic to them, meaning it's completely out of their control. There is nothing they can do to just stop feeling the way that they do. Well, many conservative Christians conversely believe that homosexuality is a choice or a lifestyle/behavior that's influenced by a person's environment. That's why you see them trying to block certain shows, or they get upset if people say SpongeBob is gay and like all that kind of stuff, or they'll say the gay agenda in media, blah blah blah. Basically, their beliefs are if a kid is surrounded by gay themes, they're going to turn out gay themselves. And all of this is why you will hear many of them be advocates for, they meaning conservative Christians, be advocates for conversion therapy because they believe being homosexual is a choice, that people can just go to therapy and stop being gay, which is ridiculous, but I feel like these two sides are the best examples to really visualize the concept of nature versus nurture. So epigenetics controls genes, and that is accomplished through nature and nurture. Nature is things like skin cells, blood cells, hair cells, liver cells, etc. And as the fetus develops into a baby through gene expression, active genes, or silencing, dormant genes, versus nature, which is environmental stimuli that can also cause genes to be turned off or turned on. So epigenetics is really everywhere. It's what you eat, where you live, who you interact with, when you sleep, how you exercise, even aging. All of these can eventually cause chemical modifications around the genes that will turn those genes on or off over time. So additionally, in certain diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's, various genes will be switched into the opposite state, away from the normal/healthy state. So the best example of this I can remember was, well, if you're listening, sorry mom, I don't mean to tell people your business, but when I was like 13 or 14 years old, I remember my mom keeping Sudoku books next to the toilet, and when I asked her what was that about, she said something about reading somewhere that experts say exercising your brain with puzzles like Sudoku will help people maintain their memory and be less likely to develop Alzheimer's later on. So, you know, just discussing the possible outcomes between a life watching TV for hours on end versus an elderly person who spends those same hours engaging in more mentally stimulating activity like Sudoku would possibly leave them able to avoid those kinds of diseases. So epigenetics is also what makes us unique. Even though we're all human beings, of course, we all have our differences. But like, you know, some people have blonde hair, some people have brown skin, some of us hate the taste of cilantro and think it tastes like soap, while others love it. Some of us are introverted, some of us are extroverted. The different combinations of genes that are turned on and off is what makes each one of us different from the next person. So there's also been research done that indicates that some epigenetic changes are even inherited. Now, a key point about epigenetics is that it's reversible. With more than 20,000 genes, what will be the result of the different combinations of genes being turned on or off? The possible arrangements are like basically infinite. But if you could map every single cause and effect of the different combinations, and if you could reverse the gene state to keep the good while eliminating the bad, then you could hypothetically cure cancer, slow aging, stop obesity, and so much more. So this is why this kind of research has been especially cutting edge over the last few decades, because science has become increasingly close and closer to being able to customize human beings and create generations of people that won't struggle with the same sort of disease issues that we have today. So there's a really great analogy I read that might help people understand what epigenetics is better. It's by Nessa Carey's book, Epigenetics Revolution. And it says, think of the human lifespan as a very long movie, okay? The cells would be the actors and actresses, they're essential units that make up the movie. DNA, in turn, would be the script, the instructions for all the participants of the movie to perform their roles. Subsequently, the DNA sequence would be the words on the script, and certain blocks of these words that instruct key actions or events to take place would be the genes. So the concept of genetics would be like screenwriting. The concept of epigenetics then would be like directing. The script can be the same, but the director can choose to eliminate or tweak certain scenes or dialogue, altering the movie for better or worse. After all, Steven Spielberg's finished product would be drastically different than Woody Allen's version of the same movie script, wouldn't it? So now that we have a more thorough scientific understanding, naturally I'm going to get into the psychological implications of epigenetics, and then we will tie this into my theory that I call the black effect. So when we discuss epigenetics in psychology, you guys have to know that there are two very important types of scientists that dedicate their lives to studying these kinds of ideas. So behavioral geneticists and behavioral epigeneticists, these scientists investigate whether epigenetics changes can help account for vulnerability to certain forms of mental illness, including conditions like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Another possibility that was what I was reading about at the library was the questions of whether epigenetic changes resulting from traumatic experiences can be passed from one generation to the next, called intergenerational transmission of trauma. Now, the one big factor in why more ample evidence to make this an official component of human life is the fact that access to human brain samples are limited. And this is important because in what they have found, for example, is that brain tissue from suicide victims found that the human glucocorticoid receptor gene promoter is also more methylated. Basically, methylated is like a fancy word for a molecule or compound. So they found these molecules or compounds in the brains of individuals who had experienced maltreatment during their childhood. And it's also been noted that a relationship between a molecular measure and reported historical exposure, so in this case, the measure of that compound being in the brain of suicide victims against their reported historical exposure of being mistreated during their childhood, it implicates the effects of epigenetics being an extraordinarily large effect on humans. So given all that information, I'm wanting to address a specific portion of this bigger scientific picture, which is this. Accepting the idea that many people who come from a lineage of peoples who experience events like famine, slavery, Holocaust, experience current mental illness that possibly stems from genetic inheritance and they don't even know it. I mean, the old saying, you are what you eat, can be true on more than just a physical level. In the context of epigenetics, the food you choose, and even the food your parents and grandparents chose, is reflected in your own personal development and risk for disease in adult life. Nutrients can actually reverse or change DNA compounds and histone modification, which histone modifications are known to play an important role in replication, transcription, heterochromatin formation, chromatin compaction, and DNA damage repair. So that's extremely telling. And given all of that, this causes the modifying of the expression of the critical genes associated with physiologic and pathologic processes like embryonic development, aging, and carcinogenesis, which is the formation of cancer. So the evidence of impact from generation to generation, the best scientific evidence that was discussed was on lumen learning that I found, which was the impact of adverse environmental conditions. So in this study, they were looking at children of women who were pregnant during 2 civilian famines of World War II, the siege of Leningrad and the Dutch hunger winter. And in the Netherlands famine, women who were previously well-nourished were subjected to low caloric intake and associated environmental stressors. And women who endured the famine in the late stages of pregnancy gave birth to smaller babies, and these children had an increased risk of insulin resistance later in life. So in addition to that, the offspring who were starved prenatally later experienced impaired glucose tolerance in adulthood, even when food was more abundant. So famine exposure at various stages of gestation was associated with a wide range of risks, such as increased obesity, higher rates of coronary heart disease, and lower birth weight. So interestingly, when examined 60 years later, people exposed to famine prenatally showed reduced DNA methylation compared to people with their unexposed same-sex siblings. Now, let's discuss my theory that I refer to as the Black effect. And basically what I mean by this is that I believe many of the mental illnesses that are faced today by the Black community, whether it's colorism, the hair texture complex, the cultural criticisms, anxiety, depression, etc., are likely linked to the concept of epigenetics. Now, of course, this isn't a new thought in and of itself. Like anybody with common sense, I'm sure any Black person who would be told or taught about epigenetics would be like, yep, that's a thing. I don't think that I've come to some crazy conclusion. But the reason why I call it the Black effect is because a lot of white people will say, I don't understand why they constantly bring up slavery that happened so long ago. It didn't even happen to them personally. And my response to that is the Black effect. The effect being Black and being a Black ancestry has led them into battling some of their tallest issues faced today, whether it's social, political, economic, or health-wise. And maybe not every Black person knows how to explain where these feelings come from, but as someone who's kind of somewhat third party and knows enough about science and history, I feel like it's very obvious that these issues stem from enslavement and slavery. And even some of the possibly anxieties and depressions could even be causes of not just slavery, but the stresses of being Black during, Jim Crow era, or even in current times. What's going to be the implications on Black children during all of this, all these deaths of Black people, Black children, Black men, Black women by the police, So all of this stuff is very impactful to future generations, and that's always been what I always keep in mind. I thoroughly believe that it is our greater shared purpose as human beings to leave a better future for the next generation. That's what you're supposed to do. And in order to have an impactful life in your own way, you don't need to be Oprah. You just need to care. And so this is just what I believe to be the Black effect, where I'm basically saying I believe these situations that have this large impact on a wide range of Black folks stems from inherited traumas that were created during these long centuries of their ancestors' enslavement. But I'm not going to just say that without explaining why I've come to that conclusion. So in 2014, The Atlantic published an article detailing a study that Emory University released the year prior that proved just how large epigenetics looms in the United States racial and ethnic health disparities, which that subject of that article was about premature births. So the United States premature birth problem is the worst in the industrialized world, especially for racial and ethnic minorities, of course. About 10.5% of white children were born before 37 weeks of gestation in 2012, along with 10.3% of Asian babies and about 11.7% of Latino children 13.6% of Native American babies, and 16.8% of Black infants arrived too soon. So Elizabeth Corwin, who's the Dean of Research at Emory University's Woodruff School of Nursing, and a team of researchers closely tracked more than 100 women during the last 3 months of their pregnancies. And they found that women of all races and ethnicities who were poor during their pregnancies were more likely to suffer from chronic stress, which is a biologically detectable and quantifiable condition. So the same was also true of middle-class Black women and all Latinas except for those who were immigrants. In fact, the problem was particularly pronounced in those last two groups. So Black women and Latinas across socioeconomic categories, those with and without insurance, college degrees, and access to the best food and information, were significantly more likely to test positive for elevated levels of stress hormones and conditions that those hormones can set in motion. So this made the women more likely to deliver their children early. Chronic stress, the team determined, is the reason approximately 30,000 more African American babies are born prematurely each year than any other group. So Corwin was saying, we all experience stress some weeks. Who doesn't feel utterly overwhelmed? But what we found was that chronic stress is something entirely different. It is created by some combination of finances, relationships, community, and experiences like racism, whether the racism is actual or perceived. So even after that, more research was done. There was a team that proved that exposure to certain chemicals can affect the genes likely to activate in the sperm and egg cells of mice 4 generations down the line. And those findings have been repeated in other large animals. So in 2013, this team published research showing that direct exposure to DDT left mice with a slightly elevated rate of certain diseases. But by the time that those mice had grandchildren, more than 50% of the male mice developed obesity. In fact, the research found that DDT left 90% of the progeny of mice originally exposed more likely to develop obesity, experience lower sperm counts, or contract other even more serious health conditions. So this pattern continued through 4 generations to the great-grandchildren of the mice originally exposed to DDT. And in the US, farmers used DDT widely after World War II to prevent insects from attacking crops, and local and state governments used it to drive down the number of disease-carrying mosquitoes. So the substance was banned in the United States in the early 1970s, but 3 generations after DDT exposure became common, the country saw major increases in human obesity. So despite these studies, a lot of people don't really consider this too often, and it's something that should be considered to try to reduce minority poverty rates, to try to address institutional racism and deal with the problem of premature births. But, at the same time, the people who are in office right now don't even believe in climate change. So regardless, the potential race and class implications of these findings are not good. 4 to 5 generations ago, the ancestors of today's middle-class African Americans were likely to be enslaved in brutal physical and emotional conditions. Large numbers of Mexican nationals came to the U.S. beginning in the 1940s to work in the agricultural industry and were regularly exposed to chemicals used in farming. Some workers were even sprayed with pesticides upon arrival. So today, Mexican Americans make up the largest portion of the nation's fast-growing Latino population. And on top of that history, informal social codes, land prices, and land use laws often leave poor communities closest to local waste facilities and mines where workers rake coal from the earth, or coastlines dotted with refineries. Now, in the future, we'll discuss intergenerational traumas more and really, unpack that in a broader way. But today I really wanted to lay that groundwork on top of some of what we have already learned about the Black community within this podcast. So in closing, I just want people to really wake up and realize that when the Black community is saying that they need help, they genuinely need help. The effects of slavery and the effects of stress during those time periods and still to this day is having troubling impacts on the mental and physical well-being of African American kids and adults in this country as we speak. African Americans are extremely vulnerable to disease, and microaggressions can have negative health-related consequences for their mental, emotional, and physical well-being. And this is happening because by epigenetically altering the expression of certain cells that control important bodily functions. So the Huffington Post has even written articles discussing epigenetic impact on the African American community and stating that the research over the last 4 decades has mounted strong evidence that race-based mistreatment on the basis of physical characteristics, whether it's hair, bone, lips, skin color, eye shape, etc., it takes a heavy toll on Black people, not only at the social, political, and economic levels of society, but also at the physiological level where cortisol, which is the body's fight or flight hormone, is seen at elevated levels in African Americans. DNA and its sequencing is genetically programmed to perform functions of the body, such as this very stress response. However, biological processes that regulate these functions can be epigenetically altered to increase the physiological stress response in the body at a higher rate and longer than what is normal. And because Black Americans and their forebears have endured over 20 generations of white-imposed race-related inequalities in every major sector in society, including persistent race-based discrimination in housing, education, healthcare, jobs, the prison industrial complex, they carry a higher burden of disease. So health and disease are no longer purely infectious in nature, but instead, social and environmental factors account for most chronic disease. And it is a function of the dynamic interaction between our genes and the larger society. And epigenetics is providing deeper understanding as to how our genes operate in these situations. So African Americans and their descendants have paid an exorbitantly high price for living in an unequal society in a number of reprehensible ways through the practice of forced labor, high incarceration rates, frequent under or unemployment, and low educational expectation. And now significant healthcare challenges are among the more salient forms of white on Black discrimination. In the absence of sweeping governmental reforms that place human rights over property rights, African Americans have to take greater ownership in their own health care by becoming better informed on effective ways to reduce stress to the extent possible given the maintenance systems of domination and oppression, and to have an impact upon the quality of Black life. Otherwise, these persistently elevated stress levels from chronic exposure to race-based discrimination have been shown to be physiologically and mentally bad for health and well-being, both at the individual and institutional levels of society. So the result is these epigenetic tags with harmful gene expressions. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something new and got some new food for thought as you ventured through this first week of July. Shout out to all of my Cancer brothers and sisters. It's Cancer season. If you are on the Apple Podcast app, please subscribe and rate this podcast if you are loving it. And if you are joining us on YouTube, please subscribe and share if you care. Thursday at 10 a.m. we will be discussing marijuana's racist ass history, and that one is going to be lit. If you would like to get any updates and informational posts for the podcast, please follow me on Instagram at Rosa.Fabuloca, where we can have greater discussion about these episodes. Until then, see you guys Thursday at 10 a.m. Bye!